Hey everyone, Joe Kral with the Society of St. Sebastian, and again, welcome to Pro-Life University. This week, we're going to jump back into a subject that I've addressed a couple times before. We're going to jump into the subject of eugenics again. This is an issue, interestingly enough, has been coming around more and more often. Obviously, it doesn't advertise itself with the name eugenics, but it is certainly there, and it certainly needs to be addressed, and this is exactly what's going on. We got various things that have happened just in the last several months, and particularly in the last year. We certainly see various states that have tried to pass prenatal non-discrimination acts that prohibit abortions on unborn children that might suffer from a genetic disability of some sort, such as Down syndrome. Interestingly enough, this is a phenomenon that is happening, that we know many children that are diagnosed with having Down syndrome, unborn children that are diagnosed as having Down syndrome, are unfortunately aborted. We know, for example, in Iceland, they virtually every child that is unborn child that's diagnosed with Down syndrome is being aborted. So this is a form of eugenics that's happening with respect to this. I mean, even Justice Thomas, in a recent opinion of his, has said this is an issue, the issue of eugenics, is something that we as a community, as a society, we're going to have to address. And we as pro-lifers have the obligation to kind of be on the forefront, leading the charge on these particular issues. We also have that case in Utah you've heard me describe about. That case where a bill was passed and signed into law at the end of March, where actually state funds could be used to create IVF embryonic children. These embryonic children are, genetically tested. If they test positive for having a particular genetic disorder, again, state funds can be used to destroy those children. Now, again, this is another form of eugenics. Again, it doesn't advertise itself as eugenics. It's trying to advertise itself as being, thoughtful, considerate, sensitive to these couples that may be suffering from a genetic disorder themselves. But again, let's face the facts. This is simply true that this is a case of legalized eugenics that's front and center in the state of Utah, for example. But even more recently, within this last week, I've seen a couple articles that I've certainly put out on Twitter through the Society of St. Sebastian. One particular article was a woman who, during this pandemic, IVF fertility clinics were closed because of the pandemic. Again, they were trying to practice safe medical practices. They gave up their PPEs so those that are on the front lines could have access to those PPEs. But during this time, she wasn't able to obviously implant any of her IVF embryonic children, but the clinic did call her and did let her know that some of her children, just simply put, weren't viable. Now, what they mean by this term viable isn't what most people think of when they think of that term. Viable just mainly means that the embryonic child didn't necessarily make the grade. It had a genetic disorder that she also was suffering from as well. And so she's been pondering what she should do. Now, the article doesn't say if she kept the children, which hopefully she has, or if she had the children frozen or even destroyed. Again, we hopefully pray, and we prayerfully pray, that she indeed keeps these children and implants them, and so they can be born, and hopefully they can live a full, healthy life. But again, it stresses this idea that eugenics is highly connected with the in vitro fertilization industry, the IVF industry. And there was another article regarding IVF this week. Again, I put it around on my account as well, dealing with artificial intelligence. Now, the IVF industry is getting these computers that examine embryos and grade these embryos. And those that have high grades are generally the ones that are implanted, and the other ones that don't make the high enough grade, because they might suffer from a genetic abnormality, which doesn't mean they can't, obviously be implanted and she can become pregnant and then the baby comes to full term and she can give birth. But even in these cases, those that don't meet that high grade because of genetic disorder, or again, They may be frozen or even destroyed. So again, we're seeing a form of eugenics that's going on here. Now, let me take a brief moment and just kind of describe what I'm talking about when we talk about this particular term, eugenics. Eugenics, typically, if we were to break down the word, means good genes. And it's the idea that you want those with the good genes to pass on the genes. Those that don't have the desirable genes shouldn't pass on their genes. And so typically we see those types of people that are destroyed. Now, obviously, there are various sorts of things we can explain, or we can talk about rather, the Holocaust, for example. That was another case of eugenics at work. All right. Obviously, we're not doing something along those lines here. We tend to practice eugenics here in the U.S. at the beginning of life. At life, where the human being is at its earliest stages of development. It's still a human being, but it's still at its earliest stages of development. So when we talk about that particular term, eugenics, this is, in many ways, this is what we're discussing right here. Now, again, to some extent, we need to also kind of get into why is this happening. We got to understand, in many ways, our culture is divided on what ethics is. And, when we go out and we engage the culture, we've got to understand the basic idea that many in the culture adhere to a utilitarian ethic, whereas many of those of us that are, practicing Christians and so forth adhere to what's called a natural law ethic. And they're two competing ethics. The utilitarian ethic, in many ways, goes off of this idea of a pleasure-pain principle. That which is pleasurable, physically speaking, emotionally speaking, and so forth, is good. Right? Painful sorts of things that are physically painful or emotionally painful, are bad. Right? And in many ways, the history of utilitarianism goes back to even to the ancient Greeks, but really John Stuart Mill's the one, kind of the modern father, if you will, of the utilitarianism as we know it of today. And it's led to such people such as Peter Singer, which many of you are probably aware of. You've probably have heard of that name. But nonetheless, when Darwin also came around and he gave his theory of evolution, we began to see utilitarians sort of pick up this idea of survival of the fittest and so forth. And those that are suffering from a genetic abnormality or a genetic disorder may not have the quality of life. So they might be suffering physical pain or emotional pain, if you will. And so this quality of life, they aren't able to achieve happiness. That's why in many respects, we see this. Well, it's painful for the person to develop this thing. It's painful for the parents that, they become a burden for the parents and everything like that. And so it's this utilitarian ethic in many ways that's driving this eugenics of today, right? This idea that happiness comes from pleasure only is obviously misinformed. We in the natural law ethic tend to think about virtue. And if you really want to get specific, especially from a Christian natural law perspective, we certainly talk about God being that final end which we're seeking. God is that happiness in which we're seeking. Virtue helps us get there because we're obeying the rule of God, if you will. And we're fulfilling our human nature because since we're made in the image and likeness of God, when we behave and act in a way in accordance to the rules, if you will, we're acting, I guess you could say, God-like. And in that way, we fulfill our nature and we can have at least a form of limited happiness in this earth. But ultimately, from a Christian perspective, we're talking about heaven. But nonetheless, there are two contrasting points of view that are banging heads with one another. And so when we go out into the world, we need to do this. This is why it's important, right? From my perspective, certainly as a natural law ethicist, when we look at this sort of thing, we talk about justice and what justice is. Justice is that which is owed to a person. Justice, from the very idea of justice, we get the idea of rights and what rights are. Right? Rights aren't something that is established by the state. Rights come from what we are as human beings. So, the most fundamental right is the right to life. Why? Because other people have the duty to let innocent people live. Right? Very simple, very straightforward. They have the moral duty to let innocent people live. Justice, right? Because which is due to the other, right? And as a result, I derive this right, the right to life, right? And so, in many respects, when we see this sort of thing, it doesn't matter if the person is disabled, from a physical injury or from a genetic abnormality or what have you. The simple fact is that they're human, and we still owe them that which is due to them, right? Which is our duty is not to kill innocent people, hence the right to life. So it doesn't matter if you're considered genetically normal or not. The simple fact is that as a human person, every human person has that particular right. Now, again, this gets into obviously some of the legal issues that we really need to look at. So obviously one of the great big things that we need to talk about are obviously these prenatal non-discrimination acts. Various states have tried to pass them. Hopefully with the Supreme Court decision coming down, we don't know yet, but hopefully that will give us some room to pass these sorts of law and have them upheld as being constitutional. That one Louisiana case that was heard before the U.S. Supreme Court just a couple months ago. But we'll have to wait and see. But nonetheless, many states have been trying to pass those laws, and I certainly encourage those laws. Those sorts of laws help recognize the humanity of the unborn, even if they're not considered normal. Right? So let's again keep that in mind. Also, we need to look, we seriously, as a pro-life movement, and I mean this wholeheartedly, we really have got to take a good hard look at the IVF industry. They are also a leading proponent of eugenics within that movement. It is clear that they adhere to a utilitarian ethic because again, in many respects, they're the ones that are doing the destroying. They don't have a problem with destroying the embryonic children and so forth. And again, many of their arguments stem from just sort of these utilitarian sorts of things. It's going to be a burden on the person that suffers that disability because they don't have a normal quality of life. It's going to be a burden on the parents, right? And it's going to be a burden on society. Well, again, that is not clear thinking. We know that every human life is valuable. Again, whether it's normal or not, the simple fact is a human person, whether they suffer from a disability or not, is still a human person, and they deserve respect. And so we got to be clear here, right? When it comes to in vitro fertilization, that state funds aren't used to create and destroy human embryos, especially those human embryos that might be suffering from genetic disabilities. That's wrong. A lot of people would probably be horrified if they learned that the Utah legislature and their governor signed something into law along those lines. That's a law that definitely does need to be repealed, right? And so we need to ensure that laws like this are happening, that they're even embryonic children that have a disability, a genetic disability, aren't destroyed because of that genetic disability, just like these prenatal non-discrimination acts regarding abortion. So, these are some various things that we, as a pro-life movement, need to seriously start considering. We've got to start trying to fight this particular thing, and I think we are, especially with the various PRENDA laws, as they're called for short, but prenatal non-discrimination acts. But these PRENDA laws are a good example of us starting really to engage this idea that eugenics is bad, and I think that's wonderful. I think that's a good start. I think we also need to start hitting into the IVF industry, most definitely, because they also practice eugenics, and we need to just simply say, no, the human embryonic child that suffers from a genetic abnormality should not be destroyed because of a genetic abnormality. Plain and simple. Right? So anyway, just food for thought. But again, we see in many respects how eugenics is happening in our own very country, and it's tragic, it's sad. I know many in both the abortion industry and the IVF industry try to wrap it up in pretty wrapping paper, if you will. to make it look like something that is acceptable. But the simple fact is that eugenics in any form is unacceptable, and we shouldn't do it. Right? Well, if you have any comments, just post them below. Again, I appreciate everything, guys. Give us a big thumbs up as always. And if you can post anything below, a question or anything that you have for me, I'll be glad to get back with you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and God bless.